Hi everyone, my name's Otis Gray, and you're listening to Sleepy. A podcast where I read old books to help you get to sleep. I hope you are having a nice transition into fall. I, for one, have been surprised how excited I was once the weather started getting cold. I was really loving summer and not looking forward to autumn, but this brisk weather has been fantastic and really great for sleeping. So I hope it has been for you too. I've got a wonderful bedtime story for you tonight, but before we start, I would like to thank all of our brand new patrons on patreon.com. Steve Pickett, Ingrid Gollisman, Wemimo, Jordan, Cheryl Chase, and Sebastian Regenbald. And for anyone who doesn't know, all of these wonderful names that I just read are brand new supporters of Sleepy on patreon.com, which is a website where you can go and support creators of the work that you like. So if the Sleepy podcast has helped you get a better night's rest and wake up more refreshed the next day, then consider going to patreon.com/sleepyradio and donating even $1 a month. It goes a really long way, and it means a lot. And at $5 a month, you get access to a whole extra poetry feed, where I send you extra poetry readings that are not on the regular podcast. But regardless, no matter how much you donate, I will read your name in the opening credits of the next show after you do. So, again, if you would like to be a part of making this show, then go to patreon.com/sleepyradio. Thank you. And as always, the music you're hearing is by my good friend James Lepkowski, and the cover art for Sleepy is by Gracie Kanan. For tonight's story, I'm currently staying out at a friend's place in Cape Cod, and there's a bunch of wonderful old books on the shelves, and found this really old copy of Cinderella and Other Stories by Richard Harding Davis, and was flipping through the book, and this popped out as one that would be great to read on the show. So tonight, I'm going to be reading The Editor's Story by Richard Harding Davis. And now is the time for you to fluff up your pillow just how you like it. Feel yourself melt into your bed. Get real comfortable. Close your eyes and let me read to you. The Editor's Story. It was a warm afternoon in the early spring, and the air in the office was close and heavy. The letters of the morning had been answered and the proofs corrected, and the gentlemen who had come with ideas worth 1 column at space rates, and which they thought worth 3, had compromised with the editor on a basis of 2, and departed. The editor's desk was covered with manuscripts in a heap that never seemed to grow less, and each manuscript bore a character of its own, as marked or as unobtrusive as the character of the man or woman who had written it, which disclosed itself in the care with which some were presented for consideration, in the vain little ribbons of others, or the selfish manner in which still others were tightly rolled or vilely scribbled. The editor held the first page of a poem in his hand and was reading it mechanically, for its length had already declared against it, unless it might chance to be the precious gem out of 1,000, which must be chosen in spite of its 20 stanzas. But as the editor read, his interest awakened, and he scanned the verses again, as one would turn to look a second time at a face which seemed familiar. At the 4th stanza, his memory was still in doubt. At the 6th, it was warming to the chase, and at the end of the page was in full cry. He caught up the 2nd page and looked for a final verse, and then at the name below, and then back again quickly to the title of the poem, and pushed aside the papers on his desk in search of any note which might have accompanied it. The name signed at the bottom of the 2nd page was Edwin Aram. The title of the poem was Bohemia, and there was no accompanying note, only the name Berkeley written at the top of the 1st page. The envelope in which it had come gave no further clue. It was addressed to the same handwriting as that in which the poem had been written, and it bore the postmark of New York City. There was no request for the return of the poem, no direction to which either the poem itself or the check for its payment in the event of its acceptance might be sent. Berkeley might be the name of an apartment house, or of a country place, or of a suburban town. The editor stepped out of his office into the larger room beyond and said, "I have a poem here that appeared in an American magazine about 7 years ago. I remember the date because I read it when I was at college. Someone is either trying to play a trick on us or to get money by stealing some other man's brains." It was in this way that Edward Aram first introduced himself to our office, and while his poem was not accepted, it was not returned. On the contrary, Mr. Aram became to us one of the most interesting of our would-be contributors, and there was no author, no matter of what popularity, for whose work we waited with greater impatience. But Mr. Aram's personality still remained as completely hidden from us as were the productions which he offered from the sight of our subscribers. For each of the poems he sent had been stolen outright and signed with his name. It was through no fault of ours that he continued to blush unseen, or that his pretty taste in poems was unappreciated by the general reader. We followed up every clue and every hint he chose to give us with enthusiasm worthy of a search after a lost explorer, and with an animus worthy of better game. Yet there was some reason for our interest. The man who steals the work of another and passes it off as his own is the special foe of every editor, but this particular editor had a personal distrust of Mr. Aram. He imagined that these poems might possibly be a trap which someone had laid for him with the purpose of drawing him into printing them, and then of pointing out by this fact how little read he was, and how unfit to occupy the swivel chair into which he had so lately dropped. Or if this were not the case, the man was in any event the enemy of all honest people, who look unkindly on those who try to obtain money by false pretenses. The evasions of Edwin Aram were many, and his methods to avoid detection not without skill. His second poem was written on a sheet of notepaper bearing the legend, "The Shakespeare Debating Club, Edwin Aram, President." This was intended to reassure us as to his literary taste and standard, and to meet any suspicion we might feel had been there no address of any sort accompanying the poem. No one we knew had ever heard of a Shakespeare Debating Club in New York City, but we gave him the benefit of the doubt until we saw that this poem, like the first, was also stolen. His third poem bore his name and an address, which on instant inquiry turned out to be that of a vacant lot on 7th Avenue near Central Park. Edwin Aram had by this time become an exasperating and picturesque individual, and the editorial staff was divided in its opinion concerning him. It was argued on one hand that, as the man had never sent us a real address, his object must be to gain a literary reputation at the expense of certain poets, and not to make any money at ours. Others answered this by saying that fear of detection alone kept Edwin Aram from sending his real address, but that as soon as his poem was printed, and he ascertained by that fact that he had not been discovered, he would put in an application for payment and let us know how quickly enough what portion of New York City his check should be forwarded. This, however, presupposed the fact that he was writing to us over his real name, which we did not believe he would dare to do. No one in our little circle of journalists and literary men had ever heard of such a man, and his name did not appear in the directory. This fact, however, was not convincing in itself, as the residents of New York moved from flat to hotel, and from apartments to boarding houses as frequently as the Bedouin changes his camping ground. We tried to draw him out at last by publishing a personal paragraph which stated that several contributions received from Edwin Aram would be returned to him if he would send stamps to his present address. The editor did not add that he would return the poems in person, but such was his warlike intention. This had the desired result, and brought us a fourth poem and a fourth address, the name of a tall building which towers above Union Square. We seemed to be getting very warm now, and the editor gathered up the 4 poems and called to his aid his friend Bronson, the ablest reporter on the New York Daily, who was to act as chronicler. They took with them letters from the authors of 2 of the poems, and from the editor of the magazine in which the first one had originally appeared, testifying to the fact that Edwin Aram had made an exact copy of the original, and wishing the brother editor good luck in catching the plagiarist. The reporter looked these over with a critical eye. The city editor told me if we caught him, he said, that I could let it run for all it was worth. I can use these names, I suppose, and I guess they have pictures of the poets at the office. He turns out to be anybody in particular. It ought to be worth a full 3 columns. Sunday paper, too. The amateur detective stood in the lower hall of the tall building, between swinging doors and jostled by hurrying hundreds while they read the names on a marble directory. "There he is," said the editor excitedly. "American Literary Bureau. One room on the 14th floor. That's just the sort of place in which we would be likely to find him." But the reporter was gazing open-eyed at a name in large letters on an office door. Edward K. Aram. It read, Commissioner of and City. "What do you think of that?" he gasped triumphantly. "Nonsense," said the editor. "He wouldn't dare. Besides, the initials are different. You're expecting too good a story." "That's the way to get them," answered the reporter as he hurried towards the office of the city director. "We don't want the proprietor of a little literary bureau. We want a big city official, and I'll believe we have one until he proves we haven't." "Which are you going to ask for?" whispered the editor. "Edward K. or Edwin?" "Edwin, I should say," answered the reporter. "He has probably given notice that mail address that way should go to him." "Is Mr. Edwin Aram in?" he asked. A clerk raised his head and looked behind him. "No," he said. "His desk is closed. I guess he's gone home for the day." The reporter nudged the editor savagely with his elbow, but his face gave no sign. "That's a pity," he said. "We have an appointment with him. He still lives at 61st Street and Madison Avenue, I believe, does he not?" "No," said the clerk. "That's his father, the commissioner, Edward K. The son lives at this address. Take the 6th Avenue elevated and get off at 116th Street." "Thank you," said the reporter. He turned a triumphant smile upon the editor. "We've got him," he said excitedly. "And the son of old Edward K., too. Think of it, trying to steal a few dollars by cribbing other men's poems. And the best story there has been in the papers for the past 3 months. Edward K. Aram's son, a thief. Look at the names. Politicians, poets, editors, all mixed up in it. It's good for 3 columns, sure. We've got to think of his people, too," urged the editor as they mounted the steps of the elevated road. "He didn't think of them," said the reporter. The house in which Mr. Aram lived was an apartment house, and the brass latchets in the hallway showed that it contained 3 suites. There were visiting cards under the latchets of the 1st and 3rd stories, and under that of the 2nd a piece of notepaper on which was written the autograph of Edwin Aram. The editor looked at it curiously. He had never believed it to be a real name. "I am sorry Edwin Aram did not turn out to be a woman," he said regretfully. "It would have been so much more interesting." "Now," instructed Bronson impressively, "whether he is in or not, we have him. If he's not in, we wait until he comes. If he doesn't come until morning, we don't leave this place until we have seen him." "Very well," said the editor. The maid left them standing at the top of the stairs while she went to ask if Mr. Aram was in, and whether he would see 2 gentlemen who did not give their names because they were strangers to him. The 2 stood silent while they waited, eyeing each other anxiously, and when the girl reopened the door, nodded pleasantly and said, "Yes, Mr. Aram is in." They hurried past her, as though they feared that he would disappear in midair, or float away through the windows before they could reach him. And yet, when they stood at last face to face with him, he bore a most disappointing air of everyday respectability. He was a tall, thin young man with light hair and mustache and large blue eyes. His back was towards the window, so that his face was in the shadow, and he did not rise as they entered. The room in which he sat was a prettily furnished one, opening into another tiny room which, from the number of books in it, might have been called a library. The rooms had a well-to-do, even prosperous air, but they did not show any evidence of a pronounced taste on the part of their owner, either in the way of which they were furnished or in the decorations of the walls. A little girl of about 7 or 8 years of age, who was standing between her father's knees, with a hand on each, and with her head thrown back on his shoulder, looked up at the two visitors with evident interest, and smiled brightly. "Mr. Aram?" asked the editor, tentatively. The young man nodded, and the two visitors seated themselves. "I wish to talk to you on a matter of private business," the editor began. "Wouldn't it be better to send the little girl away?" The child shook her head violently at this, and crowded up closely to her father, but he held her away from him gently, and told her to run and play with Annie. She passed the two visitors, with her head held scornfully in the air, and left the men together. Mr. Aram seemed to have a most passive and a curious disposition. He could have no idea as to who his anonymous visitors might be, nor did he show any desire to know. "I am the editor of the Daily Chronicle," the editor began. "My friend also writes for that periodical. I have received several poems from you lately, Mr. Aram, and one in particular, which we all liked very much. It was called Bohemia, but it is so like one that has appeared under the same title in this other magazine that I thought I would see you about it, and ask you if you could explain the similarity. You see," he went on, "it would be less embarrassing if you would do so now than later, when the poem has been published, and when people might possibly accuse you of plagiarism." The editor smiled encouragingly and waited. Mr. Aram crossed one leg over the other and folded his hands on his lap. He exhibited no interest and looked drowsily at the editor. When he spoke, it was in a tone of unstudied indifference. "I never wrote a poem named Bohemia," he said slowly. "At least, if I did, I don't remember it." The editor had not expected a flat denial, and it irritated him, for he recognized it to be the safest course the man could pursue if he kept to it. "But you don't mean to say," he protested, smiling, "that you can write so excellent a poem as Bohemia and then forget having done so?" "I might," said Mr. Aram, unresentfully, and with little interest. "I scribble a good deal." "Perhaps," suggested the reporter, politely, with the air of one who is trying to cover up a difficulty to the satisfaction of all. Mr. Aram would remember it if he saw it. The editor nodded his head in assent, and took the first page of the two on which the poem was written. and held it to Mr. Aram, who accepted the piece of foolscap and eyed it listlessly. "Yes, I wrote that," he said. "I copied it out of a book called Gems from American Poems." There was a lazy pause, but I never sent it to any paper. The editor and the reporter eyed each other with outward calm, but with some inward astonishment. They could not see why he had not adhered to his original denial of the thing in toto. It seemed to them so foolish to admit having copied the poem, and then to deny having forwarded it. "You see," explained Mr. Aram, still with no apparent interest in the matter, "I am very fond of poetry. I like to recite it, and I often write it out in order to make me remember it. I find it impresses the words on my mind. Well, that's what has happened. I have copied this poem out at the office probably, and one of the clerks there has found it, and has supposed that I wrote it, and he has sent it to your paper as a sort of joke on me. You see, Father being so well known, it would rather amuse the boys if I came out as a poet. That's how it was, I guess. Someone must have found it and sent it to you, because I never sent it." There was a moment of thoughtful consideration. "I see," said the editor. "I used to do the same thing myself when I had to recite pieces at school. I found that writing the verses down helped me to remember them. I remember that I once copied out many of Shakespeare's sonnets. But, Mr. Aram, it never occurred to me, after having copied out one of Shakespeare's sonnets, to sign my own name at the bottom of it." Mr. Aram's eyes dropped to the page of the manuscript in his hand, and rested there for some little time. Then he said, without raising his head, "I haven't signed this." "No," replied the editor, "but you signed the second page, which I still have in my hand." The editor and his companion expected some expression of indignation from Mr. Aram at this, some question of their right to come into his house and cross-examine him and to accuse him, tentatively at least, or literary fraud, but they were disappointed. Mr. Aram's manner was still one of absolute impassibility. Whether this manner was habitual to him, they could not know, but it made them doubt their own judgment in having so quickly accused him, as it bore the look of undismayed innocence. It was the reporter who was the first to break the silence. "Perhaps someone has signed Mr. Aram's name, the clerk who sent it, for instance." Young Mr. Aram looked up at him curiously and held out his hand for the second page. "Yes," he drawled. "That's how it happened. That's not my signature. I never signed that." The editor was growing restless. "I have several other poems here from you," he said. "One written from the rooms of the Shakespeare Debating Club, of which I see you are president. Your clerk could not have access there, could he? He did not write that too?" "No," said Mr. Aram doubtfully. "He could not have written that." The editor handed him the poem. "It's yours, then?" "Yes, that's mine," Mr. Aram replied. "And the signature?" "Yes, and the signature. I wrote that myself," Mr. Aram explained, "and sent it myself. That other one, Bohemia, I just copied out to remember, but this is the original with me." "And the envelope in which it was enclosed?" asked the editor. "Did you address that also?" Mr. Aram examined it uninterestingly. "Yes, that's my handwriting, too." He raised his head. His face wore an expression of patient politeness. "Oh," exclaimed the editor suddenly, in some embarrassment. "I handed you the wrong envelope. I beg your pardon. That envelope is the one in which Bohemia came." The reporter gave a hardly perceptible start. His eyes were fixed on the pattern of the rug at his feet, and the editor continued to examine the papers in his hand. There was a moment's silence. From outside came the noise of children playing in the street and the rapid rush of a passing wagon. When the two visitors raised their heads, Mr. Aram was looking at them strangely, and the fingers folded in his lap were twisting in and out. "This Shakespeare Debating Club," said the editor. "Where are its rooms, Mr. Aram?" "It has no rooms now," answered the poet. "It has been disbanded. It never had any regular rooms. We just met about and read." "I see. Exactly," said the editor. "And the house on 7th Avenue, from which your third poem was sent, did you reside there then, or have you always lived there?" "No, yes. I used to live there. I lived there when I wrote that poem." The editor looked at the reporter and back at Mr. Aram. "It is a vacant lot, Mr. Aram," he said gravely. There was a long pause. The poet rocked slowly up and down in his rocking chair and looked at his hands, which he rubbed over one another as though they were cold. Then he raised his head and cleared his throat. "Well, gentlemen," he said, "you have made out your case." "Yes," said the editor regretfully, "we have made out our case." He could not help but wish that the fellow had stuck to his original denial. It was too easy a victory. "I don't say, mind you," went on Mr. Aram, "that I ever took anybody's verses and sent them to a paper as my own. But I ask you, as one gentleman talking to another and inquiring for information, what is there wrong in doing it? I say, if I had done it, which I don't admit I ever did, where's the harm?" "Where's the harm?" cried the two visitors in chorus. "Obtaining money under false pretenses," said the editor, "is the harm you do to publishers, and robbing another man of the work of his brain and what credit belongs to him is the harm you do him, and telling a lie is the least harm done. Such a contemptible, foolish lie, too, that you might have known would surely find you out, in spite of the trouble you took, too." "I never asked you for any money," interrupted Mr. Aram quietly. "But we would have sent it to you, nevertheless," reported the editor, "if we had not discovered in time that the poems were stolen." "Where would you have sent it?" asked Mr. Aram. "I never gave you a right address, did I? I ask you, did I?" The editor paused in some confusion. "Well, if you do not want the money, what did you want?" he exclaimed. "I must say, I should like to know." Mr. Aram rocked himself to and fro, and gazed at his two inquisitors with troubled eyes. "I didn't see any harm in it then," he repeated. "I don't see any harm in it now. I didn't ask you for money. I sort of thought," he said confusedly, "that I should like to see my name in print. I wanted my friends to see it. I'd have liked to have shown it well, I'd like my wife to have seen it. She's interested in literature and books and magazines and things like that. That's all I wanted. That's why I did it." The reporter looked up askance at the editor, as a prompter watches the actor to see if he is ready to take his cue. "How do I know that?" demanded the editor sharply. He found it somewhat difficult to be severe with this poet, for the man admitted so much readily and would not defend himself. Had he only blustered and grown angry and ordered them out, instead of sitting helplessly there rocking to and fro and picking at the back of his hands, it would have made it so much easier. "How do we know," repeated the editor, "that you did not intend to wait until the poems had appeared, and then send us your real address and ask for the money, saying that you had moved since you had last written it?" "Oh," protested Mr. Aram, "you know I never thought of that." "I don't know anything of the sort," said the editor. "I only know that you have forged and lied and tried to obtain money that doesn't belong to you, and that I mean to make an example of you and frighten other men from doing the same thing. No editor has read every poem that was ever written, and there is no protection for him from such fellows as you, and the only thing he can do when he does catch one of you is to make an example of him. That's what I am going to do. I am going to make an example of you. I am going to nail you up as people nail up dead crows to frighten off the live ones. It is my intention to give this to the papers tonight, and you know what they will do with it in the morning." There was a long and most uncomfortable pause, and it is doubtful if the editor did not feel it as much as the other man did opposite to him. The editor turned to his friend for a glance of sympathy, or of disapproval even, but even that gentleman still sat bending forward with his eyes fixed on the floor, while he tapped the top of his cane against his teeth. "You don't mean," said Mr. Aram, in a strangely different voice from which he had spoken, "that you would do that?" "Yes, I do," blustered the editor. But even as he spoke, he was conscious of a sincere regret that he had not come alone. He could intuitively feel Bronson mapping out the story in his mind and memorizing Aram's every word and taking mental notes of the framed certificates of high membership in different military and Masonic associations which hung upon the walls. And it had not been long since the editor was himself a reporter, and he could see that it was as good a story as Bronson could ever wish it to be. But he reiterated, "Yes, I mean to give it to the papers tonight." "But think," said Aram. "Think, sir, who I am. You don't want to ruin me for the rest of my life, just for a matter of $15, do you? $15 that no one has lost either. If I had embezzled $1 million or so, or if I had robbed the city, well, good. I'd have taken big risks for big money. But you are going to punish me just as hard because I tried to please my wife, as though I had robbed a mint. No one has really been hurt, he pleaded. The men who wrote the poems, they've been paid for them. They've got all the credit for them they can get. You've not lost a cent. I have not gained anything by it. And yet you gentlemen are going to give this thing to the papers. And as you say, sir, we know what they will make of it. What with my being my father's son and all that, my father is going to suffer. My family is going to suffer. It will ruin me. The editor put the papers back into his pocket. If Bronson had not been there, he might possibly instead have handed them over to Mr. Aram, and the story would never be written. But he could not do that now. Mr. Aram's affairs had become the property of the New York newspaper. Thank you for listening to Sleepy. Good night.